The autumn of 1,942 inches northern Europe was cold and wet. Damp air filled the barracks, engines sank into mud, and soldiers lacked one of the most basic necessities, clean water. Rivers and wells were often contaminated with rust, oil, or decay. Illnesses caused by infection spread quickly, weakening men more effectively than bullets. The Army command was aware of the problem, but amid large-scale combat operations, sanitation seemed a minor concern. At a military production plant near Hamburg, an engineer named Gerhard Lang was working on filtration systems for fuel engines. Before the war, he had been part of civilian industry, helping to design filters for coffee machines and industrial devices. With the outbreak of war, his expertise in microporous materials became valuable for military use. Lang was a methodical man, precise, reserved, and indifferent to ideology. He saw his work not as service to a cause, but as a technical challenge. At the factory, which produced engine parts for vehicles and aircraft, he was responsible for developing systems that could separate impurities from oil and fuel. One evening, while examining a new batch of materials, his attention was caught by sheets of cellulose fiber used in the laboratory for filtering coffee. The material was light, durable, and resistant to heat. Lang wondered if the same concept could be applied to water purification. If a coffee filter could trap fine particles, perhaps it could also filter out sediment and bacteria. The Army's existing water filters, metal screens, and gauze clogged easily and offered little protection from contamination. It was a simple thought, almost trivial, but he decided to test it. He filled a metal cup with muddy water from a drainage ditch near the factory, placed a folded sheet of the filter paper over it, and let the liquid pass through. Minutes later, the water that dripped into the container below was visibly clearer. It was far from sterile, but far safer to drink. Lang made notes of his experiment, but considered it only a curiosity. His official work with fuel filtration took priority. Weeks later, a group of military inspectors arrived at the plant. They were reviewing all developments that could improve Army efficiency. One officer learned of Lang's side experiments and requested a demonstration. After observing the simple test, they decided to send a small batch of the filters for field evaluation. The filters were tested in a frontline unit stationed in the swamps of East Prussia. Soldiers there often drank directly from streams or puddles. Within days, they noticed that using the filters reduced sickness. Reports reached the logistics command. At first, officers dismissed the results as coincidence. But when medical records confirmed fewer cases of dysentery in the unit using the filters, the idea gained attention. Back at the factory, the project was quietly authorized under a technical code name. Officially, it was recorded as auxiliary filtration material for field use. War secrecy demanded that such innovations remain unpublicized. Lang continued refining the design, increasing fiber density, and treating the paper with a mild antiseptic coating that further reduced bacterial risk. As the war dragged on, clean water became even more critical. Boiling water was not always possible in combat zones. There was little fuel and less time. A lightweight, disposable filter suddenly became a practical necessity. Soon, the product was being issued in small, sealed packets, circular sheets, that soldiers could carry in their uniform pockets. Each could filter several liters before being discarded. Its simplicity made it accessible to anyone, even the wounded or exhausted. Lang knew little about the filter's growing use across the front. Communication moved slowly, and the military rarely credited civilian engineers. He continued his daily work among the noise of machinery and the smell of oil. But occasionally, he noticed in supply reports a reference to single-use filtration elements for individual use. That was all the confirmation he needed. Somewhere far from his workshop, soldiers were drinking water that would otherwise have poisoned them. In the propaganda of 1942, such inventions were never mentioned. Anything not directly related to weaponry remained invisible. Yet it was often these quiet, practical solutions that changed survival rates more than victories in battle. When medicine, fuel, and time were scarce, a scrap of paper capable of cleaning water could mean the difference between life and death. This story did not begin with orders or ambition, but with the curiosity of one engineer, a man who wondered what might happen if a coffee filter were given another purpose. As often happens in war, a small experiment, born of chance, would go on to save countless lives. By early 1943, the cellulose filter had moved quietly through the layers of the military bureaucracy. It was not a formal project, yet it had found a place in supply chains under the label of temporary filtration aid. The invention spread not through orders, but through necessity. Field units requested more, and the supply officers, unaware of its civilian origin, simply added it to their lists. In the frozen landscapes of the Eastern Front, soldiers learned to trust it. The filter paper, small and weightless, became a part of their daily routine. Some used it inside helmets or tin cups, folding it several times to strain brown river water into something drinkable. It was not perfect, but it reduced sickness, and that was enough. Commanders noticed that units using the filters required fewer medical evacuations for intestinal infections. Reports reached logistics departments, and soon the filters appeared in more ration kits. At the factory, Lang continued his regular duties, still unaware of the growing demand. His improvements remained modest: stronger fibers, better coatings, smaller pores. The cellulose paper was treated with a thin chemical layer that resisted mold and neutralized certain contaminants. It was simple chemistry, nothing revolutionary. But in a war, where overcomplication often led to failure, simplicity was the real advantage. The German army, stretched thin across multiple fronts, relied heavily on improvisation. Standardized water purification equipment was expensive and difficult to transport. Metal filters froze in the cold, and cloth ones deteriorated quickly. The paper filters, by contrast, were almost invisible in logistical terms, a few grams of material that could prevent disease in dozens of men. When one division quartermaster noticed the improved health reports, he forwarded a recommendation to Central Supply. The request was filed and forgotten among thousands of documents, but it kept the filters in circulation. In the fragmented structure of wartime logistics, survival tools often spread by rumor rather than command. Soldiers shared them, copied them, traded them, and the filter's reputation grew quietly. Meanwhile, new trials were ordered in mountain and desert conditions. Tests in North Africa confirmed that the paper retained strength even in high temperatures. A variation of the design, produced by another plant using Lang's formula, was distributed to field engineers. For the first time, his invention was officially mentioned in technical documentation as Type L cellulose filter, named only by the first letter of his surname. Lang read the report with a sense of detached satisfaction. He never saw himself as a hero or innovator. The war had taken that kind of pride away from him. But he understood the practical importance of what he had done. Each soldier who could drink clean water was one less casualty, one more survivor in a conflict that devoured lives without pause. As 1943 progressed, the front moved deeper into the east, and conditions worsened. Mud, cold, and disease made the environment as deadly as combat. Field medics reported cases where men survived solely because they avoided contaminated water. Though few knew it, the filter had become a quiet line of defense, one that did not fire or explode, yet saved more lives than most weapons. Back at the factory, rumors began to circulate. Workers whispered that something they made was being used by soldiers at the front, though no one knew exactly what it was. The official paperwork revealed nothing. Shipments were listed as technical paper for military use. The secrecy was deliberate. The command wanted no publicity, fearing that Allied intelligence could exploit the design. In reality, the Allies already had similar concepts, though none were as widespread. The war had become not only a contest of armies, but of materials, chemistry, and invention. Small discoveries often made the difference between endurance and collapse. Lang rarely thought about recognition. He focused on refining the process, seeking ways to make production faster and safer. The filters were now pressed in circular shapes, sterilized under heat, and packaged in wax paper. Each batch underwent a simple test: muddy water poured through. It had to emerge visibly clear. By the end of the year, thousands of units had been distributed across Europe. They traveled with medical supplies, rations, and field kits. Soldiers used them instinctively, never knowing who had created them. To most, they were just another piece of equipment, small, replaceable, and essential. For Lange, the project remained anonymous, hidden behind factory codes and war reports. Yet deep down, he understood the paradox of it all. In a time when human life was measured by tonnage of ammunition and liters of fuel, something as fragile as a coffee filter had become a tool of survival. By 1944, the cellulose filter had become a silent companion of the German army. It appeared in supply crates, field kitchens, and medical stations. Few soldiers questioned where it came from. It was simply there, a small piece of folded paper that made foul water drinkable. In a war of steel and fire, such a fragile object seemed insignificant, yet it quietly saved lives every day. Frontline medics began to notice a consistent pattern. Units using the filters had fewer cases of dysentery, fewer collapses from dehydration, and shorter recovery times. Commanders saw the benefit but rarely documented it. Medical records did not mention brand names or inventors. They only showed that men in certain regions were surviving longer. Lang continued to work far from the front, still unaware of how widespread his idea had become. The factory where he served remained under constant strain. Resources were scarce, electricity unreliable, and bombings frequent. Production lines were often stopped by air raids, yet the section responsible for filter material was always restored first. Officially, it was essential for fuel and water safety. Unofficially, some officers already knew its true purpose. In early 1944, reports from the Eastern Front described entire units surviving long marches thanks to makeshift water points. Soldiers filled their canteens from snowmelt, puddles, or shell craters, trusting the small filters tucked in their ration packs. In desperate retreats, they even used the paper to strain water, mixed with ash and soil. It was a fragile act of survival, one that often worked. As the war dragged on, the filter's quiet success began to attract cautious attention. Military engineers requested a new batch with reinforced fibers, fearing shortages of raw materials. Lang's department responded by adapting cellulose substitutes made from wood pulp. The change made the filters cheaper and faster to produce, though slightly less durable. It didn't matter. Most soldiers used them only once before discarding them. Meanwhile, Allied forces advancing from the west began finding these paper discs among captured German equipment. Intelligence officers initially assumed they were maps, instructions, or coded papers. Only after laboratory tests did they realize their true function. The discovery surprised even the Allies. A simple coffee-inspired filter, developed in a small factory, had become an unsung tool of wartime survival. Back in Hamburg, Lang's reality was collapsing. The city had been bombed repeatedly, and the industrial district lay in ruins. The factory continued operating in fragments, moving production to safer rural sites. Lang worked by candlelight, recording chemical tests on scraps of paper. He no longer received updates from the military command. Supply chains were broken, and shipments vanished in chaos. Still, he persisted. For him, the war had become secondary to the work itself. Each refined batch of paper felt like a quiet act of logic in a world that had lost reason. He experimented with layers of resin, discovering that a thin coating could preserve filters for months without decay. It was a technical success that came too late to matter to the Army, but would later influence post-war water purification methods. By late summer, the front had collapsed on both sides. The filters, once carefully distributed through official channels, now traveled informally through soldiers' hands. Men traded them, shared them with civilians, and left them behind in abandoned camps. In occupied villages, people used them to strain contaminated well water. What began as a military supply had become a humanitarian tool without anyone realizing it. Lang never saw the front or the soldiers who used his invention, but across the ruined landscape of Europe, his work continued its quiet service. A thin layer of cellulose and chemistry, born from an idea about coffee, had become a symbol of survival in a collapsing world. When the war finally neared its end, no one remembered his name. Reports were lost and files destroyed. The small filters were never listed among official equipment. Yet traces of them remained in the testimonies of medics, in soldiers' diaries, in fragments found in canteens years later. While nations counted victories and defeats, the war's smaller inventions, the ones without glory, faded into silence, but their legacy endured, hidden in the ordinary. And somewhere, in a ruined workshop north of Hamburg, an aging engineer quietly continued to test paper, unaware that his creation had already outlived the war itself. When the war ended in 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Factories were burned, records destroyed, and the people who had built the machinery of war were scattered. Among them was Gerhard Lange, a quiet engineer with little to show for years of work except a few notebooks and a head full of formulas. His factory no longer existed, bombed to rubble in the final months. He salvaged what he could: samples of treated paper and handwritten notes about cellulose fibers, water absorption, and pore density. For a time, Lang lived as a displaced worker, moving between small towns that had escaped destruction. The war had erased the boundary between military and civilian life, and survival meant rebuilding from the ground up. In one village, a local doctor learned of Lang's background and asked him to help make filters for the hospital. Contaminated wells and broken infrastructure had left communities desperate for clean water. Using scraps of paper, cotton, and resin, Lang recreated his wartime process on a small scale. The results were modest but effective. The filters removed visible impurities and bacteria, allowing hospitals to treat patients with safer water. Nobody there knew that the method had once served soldiers on the front lines. The war's inventions were slowly being repurposed for peace, quietly, without acknowledgement. In the late 1940s, Allied technical commissions investigated wartime innovations in chemistry and material science. Reports surfaced describing cellulose-based filtration papers used in German military logistics. No names were attached to the discovery, but it caught the attention of manufacturers rebuilding Europe's consumer industries. Within a few years, similar materials began appearing in household products, medical masks, laboratory filters, and coffee strainers. What had begun as an improvised wartime solution quietly became part of daily life again, this time for ordinary people. Lang never patented his design or claimed ownership. He had no documents, no resources, and no interest in recognition. His work had been about solving problems, not preserving credit. Still, fragments of his ideas survived in post-war engineering journals and trade manuals that borrowed from wartime research. By the early 1952s, cellulose filters were being used around the world, saving lives in hospitals and disaster zones. In one of his surviving notebooks, a short line stood out among technical equations: clean water should not depend on peace. It summed up his quiet philosophy that invention, no matter how small, could exist beyond the politics that created it. Over time, the story of the wartime coffee filter faded into obscurity. The official histories of World War II focused on weapons, battles, and political leaders. The quiet tools of survival, the innovations that saved lives rather than took them, rarely found a place in textbooks. Yet those who worked in the field of materials science recognized the subtle legacy. The combination of paper strength, porosity, and simplicity that Lange had developed became a foundation for later filtration systems used by soldiers, scientists, and explorers alike. Decades later, In the 1,960 seconds, a historian researching wartime technology came across scattered reports mentioning cellulose filters for individual use and traced them back to a destroyed factory near Hamburg. There was no record of who designed them. Only after interviewing surviving workers did the name Gerhard Lang appear not as a famous inventor, but as a quiet man who worked late at night testing paper and water. In the years that followed, a small archive was created to preserve documents related to civilian science during wartime. Among its displays was a single sheet of yellowed cellulose, labeled simply Prototype Water Filter 1943. No grand explanation accompanied it. Visitors often passed it without a glance, unaware that such a simple object had once made the difference between life and death for countless soldiers. Lang lived long enough to see the world move past the war, though he never spoke publicly about his role. He died in the early 1,970 seconds, leaving no family, only his notes. But by then, his concept had long outgrown him. The idea that safe water could be made accessible with nothing more than paper had spread far beyond the battlefields where it began. In the end, his story remained an example of how necessity turns into invention, and how invention, once born, belongs to everyone. A coffee filter, designed for comfort, had become a tool for survival. And though nobody expected it, the quiet precision of one engineer had saved lives in a war that seemed determined to destroy them.